A journey through the UK. I had always imagined the United Kingdom as a land of quiet legends and grey horizons, a place where history wasn't just locked in museums, but seeped through the cracks in the cobblestone streets. It called to me in half-remembered films, in novels with fog on the moors, and in stories my grandmother used to tell. She'd visited once in her youth and spoke of it with a reverence usually reserved for church. So in the spring of 2025, I booked a one-way ticket to London with a modest budget, an old camera, and a loosely drawn plan that depended more on curiosity than logistics. I wasn't searching for anything in particular, just a land that had seen centuries unravel, and maybe, along the way, let it teach me how to slow down. London greeted me with drizzle and impatience. Heathrow buzzed like a hornet's nest, and I followed the crowd until I was on the Piccadilly line, heading into the heart of the city. My first hostel was in South Kensington, tucked between whitewashed terraces and blooming cherry blossoms. I dropped my bag and wandered almost immediately, unable to sit still. Hyde Park opened up before me like an urban sanctuary. Locals jogged, kids kicked footballs through fallen petals, and I sat on a bench beneath a budding elm, jet-lagged, but deeply content. By evening, I'd walked to Westminster and stared up at Big Ben as if it might chime just for me. I crossed the Thames, watched the London Eye slowly turn, and ended up in a pub in Soho where I nursed a pint of bitter and listened to accents from a country swirl around me. Over the next week, I moved like a pilgrim through the city, Trafalgar Square, the British Museum, Camden Market, the Tower of London. I marvelled at how London wasn't one city, but 1,000 folded into each other like layers in a... I spent a damp morning in the Tate Modern, letting abstract colours blur my thoughts, and a sunny afternoon at Portobello Road Market, where I bought a second-hand poetry book with someone else's name scribbled inside. But it was an evening walk along the South Bank that settled into my memory most sharply. The street lamps glowed gold on the water, a busker played violin under Waterloo Bridge, and the air smelled faintly of rain and roasted chestnuts. That was... I wasn't a tourist, not really. I was a quiet witness, walking through someone else's story while writing my own. On the advice of a retired professor, I met in a bookshop cafe near Bloomsbury. I took a train north to York. He'd scribbled suggestions in my notebook. Shambles, Minster, ghost walks, tea rooms. The countryside rolled by in shades of emerald and ochre, dotted with sheep and stone fences that sliced the land into centuries-old patterns. York charmed me immediately. The ancient walls circled the city like a protective embrace, and I walked them under a grey sky that matched the rooftops. At York Minster, I craned my neck to admire stained glass that seemed to capture sunlight just long enough to make you believe in me. I wandered the Shambles, where overhanging timbered buildings leaned so close they nearly kissed, and bought a scarf from a cheerful woman who told me her shop was once a butcher's long before electricity came to the street. That evening, I joined a ghost tour led by a wiry man in a top hat who grinned like he knew something you didn't. We walked cobbled alleys and paused beneath windows with dark history. He told stories of Viking curses, Roman legions buried beneath modern foundations, and spirits that still wandered the city in misty silence. I didn't see any ghosts, but I felt something ancient in York's bones, like it had never stopped remembering. From York, I travelled to the Lake District, inspired by the idea of swapping cities for silence. I took a coach to Windermere and immediately felt the shift. The air was heavier with moisture, and the kind of silence that only exists in. I checked into a small guest house near Grasmere, owned by a gentle couple named Peter and Nora, who fed me lamb stew and insisted I borrow a pair of proper hiking boots. Each day, I set off along trails that wove through valleys and over ridges, always with a packed lunch and a flask of tea in my bag. I climbed Helm Crag, explored the edges of Derwent Water, and visited Dove Cottage, where Wordsworth once scribbled about clouds and solitude. I sat by the lake, trying to write something of my own, but mostly I just stared into the ripples and felt my thoughts soften like butter on warm bread. One morning, wrapped in layers and mist, I climbed Scafell Pike. The weather turned halfway up, and I found myself soaked and laughing, slipping along stone paths and waving at strangers who shared the same reckless love for the sky. At the summit, it was 0, but we shared chocolate and stories. And in that whiteness, I felt more connected than in any crowd. That night, back at the guest house, I dried my clothes by the fire while Peter told me about the time he'd met David Attenborough. Whether it was true didn't matter. It was the kind of tale the lakes inspired. I made my way south to Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace, because some pilgrimages are obligatory. The town was neat and polite, its timbered houses and manicured gardens like a well-kept stage. I visited the Bard's home, sat in the theatre where his words still echoed, and saw a performance of Twelfth Night that left me dizzy with language. Afterward, I shared a drink with a Canadian couple I'd met in the queue, and we laughed about how lost we'd find the best pie shop in town. I wanderlust in the fog, my journey through England. The plane touched down at Heathrow on a misty Monday morning, the kind of grey, shrouded welcome one would expect from England in early spring. A gentle drizzle streaked across the oval window, distorting the view of the runway lights and casting the scene in a gauze. It was oddly romantic, like the opening to an old British film, and I leaned my forehead against the cold glass, letting the atmosphere settle into my bones. I had arrived in England, the land of Shakespeare and Stonehenge, of warm pubs, chasm, and I was ready to be lost in it. The immigration officer at the terminal looked up briefly from my passport and gave a small smile when I told him I was here for 3 weeks of solo travel. "Just the weather for it," he said dryly, stamping my entry with a firm Outside, London was waking up in that reserved, unhurried way that cities sometimes do on cloudy mornings. Double-decker buses slid past black cabs, pedestrians, in long coats and scarves, bustled across wet crosswalks. The smell of diesel and fresh pastry mingled in the damp air. I pulled my suitcase behind me as I walked into Paddington Station, the arched ceiling echoing with the clatter of rolling luggage and the hum of announcements in crisp British accent. My first stop was a modest little hotel near Hyde Park, a red-bricked Victorian building with ivy crawling up one side and a faded blue sign that read, "The Lancaster House." The room was small but charming, with floral curtains, a squeaky tiny window that looked out over a quiet street of identical facades. I dropped my bags and collapsed on the bed for a while. Not quite asleep, not fully awake. The time zone shift pulling at my senses like an I lay there with my eyes closed, listening to the muffled sounds of the street below, the whir of bicycle tires, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant rumble of a bus passing by. It felt like the world was whispering to me, beckoning me to come outside, and by afternoon, I ventured into the city, determined to walk off the jet lag. I began in Kensington Gardens, where the rain had lightened to a mist and joggers splashed through puddles with practiced indifference. The trees were just beginning to bud, and the air smelled of wet earth and fresh growth. I wandered past the Albert Memorial, its gilded figure shining stubbornly beneath a grey sky, and made my way to the Serpentine, where swans drifted across the water. I fed a few ducks from a paper bag I had picked up at a nearby vendor and watched as the city moved around me with a quiet, self-assured pace. I took a long route to the Natural History Museum, cutting through narrow lanes lined with Georgian townhouses and past cozy cafes where people nursed cappuccinos behind fogged-up windows. The museum itself was a marvel, a cathedral of a grand Romanesque facade and soaring arches inside that made you feel like you were entering a sacred place. I stood for nearly 10 minutes beneath the massive skeleton of a blue whale, suspended from the ceiling like a dream, and felt very small in the best possible way. I wandered through rooms filled with gemstones, fossils, and intricate models, letting the quiet murmur of other visitors drift past me as I imagined the stories behind each exhibit. In the days that followed, London revealed itself to me slowly, like a book that demands patient reading. I explored Westminster Abbey, where the dead rested in stately silence, and the air was thick with incense and centuries of reverence. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase of St. Paul's Cathedral to the whispering gallery, my thighs burning with each step, and whispered into the curved wall, grinning when I heard my own voice come back from across the dome. I stood on the glass floor bridge and watched the Thames flow beneath my feet, imagining the countless lives that had moved along this ancient waterway. At the British Museum, I wandered for hours, losing track of time among the Rosetta Stone, the Elgin marbles, and the intricate mosaics of lost civilizations. I traced hieroglyphics with my eyes and wondered what secrets they still held. Evenings, I found hidden pubs with names like the Red Lion or the Dog and Duck, where the beer was warm, the fire crackled merrily, and locals chattered in accents I could only half understand. I developed a taste for steak and ale pie and learned to appreciate the strange comfort of mushy peas. I struck up conversations with strangers who shared stories of their city with pride and warmth. I found a sense of camaraderie in those rooms, a kind of unspoken welcome that made the city feel less like a place and more like a living, breathing friend. But it wasn't just the grand attractions that captured my heart. It was the little moments, a busker singing Leonard Cohen outside Covent Garden, the way strangers held doors open with a polite nod, the quiet hum of the tube, the rhythm of light his skin. I walked everywhere, wore out my shoes, and let my map grow soft and torn at the edges. I even took a Jack the Ripper walking tour one foggy night, the guide's voice theatrical as he led us through narrow alleys in Whitechapel, painting vivid tales of Victorian terror while our breath puffed in the cold air. We ended at a pub where I warmed my hands around a cup of mulled wine and let the shadows of history dance in my mind. I took a day trip to Oxford by train, watching the city unfold through rain-streaked windows. The university town had a storybook charm, with its honey-coloured stone buildings and ancient libraries. I wandered through the Bodleian Library and marvelled at its round, domed silhouette rising like a temple to knowledge. I had lunch at a pub once, frequented by J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and I swear I could feel the ghosts of hobbits and lions lingering in the wood-panelled walls. I explored the courtyards of various colleges, peeking and imagining what it must be like to study in such a place. A group of students in academic robes passed by, laughing. And for a moment, I felt like I had stepped into another world. A few days later, I journeyed to Bath, where the Romans had built temples and thermal baths thousands of years ago. The city was a vision in pale limestone, perched along the River Avon like a postcard brought to life. I soaked in the modern thermy bath, steam curling around my face as I floated in rooftop waters and watched the spires of Bath Abbey pierce the sky. I imagined Jane Austen walking these very streets, writing letters or daydreaming about Mr. Darcy beneath the colonnades. I toured the Roman Baths Museum, marvelling at how the ancient hot springs still bubbled up through the earth, and wandered through the Fashion Museum, the elegance of bygone eras. I ended the day with a cream tea in a sunlit tea room, savouring the soft scones and thick clotted cream. From Bath, I headed west to the windswept coast of Cornwall. The train ride was long but scenic, and I arrived in St. Ives just as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold. The sea air was sharp and invigorating, the kind that fills your soul. I stayed in a small inn perched on a cliff, where the waves crashed below like a lullaby. I spent my days hiking along the southwest coast path, the cliffs tumbling into turquoise coves, and my evenings eating fresh-caught fish while watching the tide roll in. I visited artist studios and tiny galleries drawn in by the region's grit. One morning I took a boat tour and saw seals lounging on rocks, their eyes half-lidded and content. One of my favourite days in Cornwall was when I visited Tintagel Castle, rumoured to be the birthplace of King Arthur. The ruins stood high on a rocky headland, lashed by wind and salt spray. As I climbed the narrow steps carved into the cliff, transported half in history, half in myth. I stood alone on a stone platform and let the wind whip through my hair, staring out at the restless sea, and felt a strange kinship with all the dreamers who had come here before me. I explored Merlin's cave at low tide, the waves echoing again, and let my imagination run wild with tales of knights and sorcery. The last leg of my journey took me north. I boarded a train bound for the Lake District, and as the landscape changed from rolling fields to rugged hills, I pressed my face to the window, entranced. Windermere greeted me with still waters and low clouds, a world of reflection and quiet. I stayed in a B&B run by an elderly couple who served fresh scones and tea every afternoon. I rented a bike and cycled around the lake, stopping often to breathe, to sit, to marvel. The land felt ancient, alive. I explored Ambleside, hiked the fells, and spent long afternoons in solitude among the trees. Each step felt like a meditation, each breath a prayer of gratitude. I hiked part of the route once walked by Wordsworth, stopping at Dove Cottage to pay my respects. I carried a slim volume of his poetry in my backpack and read lines aloud beneath an old oak, the wind answering back in whispers. Here, a sense that life moves slower and more deeply. I watched sheep grazing on hillsides, boats bobbing in the water, and light shifting across the peaks like a symphony of clouds. One rainy afternoon, I sat in a lakeside cafe and wrote pages in my journal, my thoughts flowing as freely as a stream. The Lake District gave me space to reflect, to breathe, to feel. My last stop before returning to London was York, a walled city steeped in Viking history and medieval charm. I walked the ancient city walls, wandered through the narrow lanes of the shambles, and stood in awe beneath the soaring ceiling of York. On my final night, I joined a ghost tour through the city's cobbled streets. The stories both chilling and oddly beautiful in the flickering glow of lanterns. I tasted Yorkshire pudding and wandered through the Jorvik Viking Centre at the ingenuity of those early settlers. When I returned to London for my flight home, the city felt different, familiar now, almost intimate. I revisited a few of my favourite spots one last time, bought a book from a tiny shop near Notting Hill, and sat in Hyde Park with a warm, watching the world go by. My suitcase was heavier, my shoes worn, my heart full. I spent my last evening walking along the South Bank, watching the London Eye sparkle in the distance and listen to the soft lapping of the Thames against the embankment. England had not been what I expected. It had been more. Not just a land of postcard landmarks and famous names, but a place that lived and breathed in its quiet moments, its foggy mornings, its rolling countryside and weathered. I had come looking for adventure, and I had found something deeper, a connection, a quiet joy, a sense of being both very far from home and completely at peace. I had discovered the soul of a country not in its guidebooks, but in its everyday, the pauses between the landmarks, the stories behind the stones, the warmth beneath the grey. As the plane ascended into the clouds, I looked down one last time at the patchwork of green fields and winding roads below, and whispered a soft promise. I'll be back.